Was war denn, Lisa? Brother.
Brother, may I have some oats?
How do you call it?
I know you're all curious about whether you'll be able to buy a house at some point. And some people suggested that maybe this would be a very short talk, and that I would simply say, no. That would be that. And yes, no. This is a new talk for me. I'm curious as to how it's going to turn out. Be interested to see what I have to say. But I've been thinking about this for some time. It's kind of an offshoot of some thoughts I've had on land use, and that ties in, as I think you'll see, to housing affordability, and everybody's talking about affordable housing and so forth, and so we'll dive into some of this. Gen Z, which I guess most of you are Gen Z, are thinking about why it is seemingly very difficult for your generation and maybe people slightly older than you to buy a house. And as I'll say a little later, that's not without grounds. I mean, there are some reasons that you may be finding it difficult to afford housing. And we'll talk about some of this. Now, I created this a few months ago in a conversation I was having with a relative about housing, and I was basically taking the position that it's not quite as bad as the memes suggest, and that there are some workarounds. There are some ways that people can afford housing. And so I want to start off by addressing some of the misconceptions that people have about housing, and then talk about some of the reasons that people find it seemingly stressful. Well, not just seemingly, it is actually stressful to try to think about how to buy a house and whether you'll be able to afford it. So the first thing I want to mention here is a kind of a myth that went around, I think, last fall, and it's continued to go around. I've seen it in recent material on housing affordability. There was this claim based on a National Association of Realtors survey that first-time home buyers now have an average age of 40, and that this is substantially higher than it once was, that if you go back to 2021, it was only 33, and so something's happened to average age of home buyers, suggesting that people are basically being shut out of the market if you're younger. Now, again, I'll say later why there are some pressures on younger people who are trying to buy housing, but the average age has not actually increased or decreased very much over the last couple of decades. A study by housing economists Edward Pinto and Joseph Tracy found that the way that the National Association of Realtors study was done led to some unreliable results, that in fact the actual first-time home buyer has a median age of only 33, and that this has not substantially changed for the last quarter century. The National Association of Realtors is there in gray. You can see the sharp increase that they suggested had occurred since 2021. I hate to quote the Federal Reserve authoritatively here, but their survey actually was better carried out, and it shows not much change in the last 25 years. So average age is not substantially increasing. Another common theme to some of the online discussion about housing is that institutional buyers are driving up demand. And there's actually been some policy that's trying to constrain private equity firms that are buying up residential housing and thereby pushing up prices in some markets. So yes, higher demand does drive up prices. This Econ 101, we shouldn't be surprised to see some of this, but what exactly are we concerned about here with firms like Blackstone that are buying up houses? They're doing this to make money, which means they're not going to buy up houses and simply leave them vacant. They're going to do something with that housing. And so one model for them could be to buy the house, refurbish the house, and then resell it, kind of house flipping, if you will, rehabbing houses. And they would then buy housing in places where they think the price is generally low. That would tend to push house prices up. They would then tend to sell in places and at times that they believe that the prices are relatively high, and so that would tend to lower prices. So the net effect of this institutional buying would not be to substantially drive up prices. Now, you may have, again, certain localities at certain times where you may see an effect, but the general effect shouldn't be all that significant. The other way they could make money off of this is to buy and then rent. Well, you know, if you supply more housing into the rental market, that's going to drive down rents. Now, these institutional buyers cannot force everyone to rent. I know that that's been part of the narrative on this, but the people who want to buy versus rent also constitute some demand in the market, and the institutional buyers have to satisfy that demand as well. So they have to respond to what people want. They cannot dictate. They have to entrepreneurially read the market, figure out how people want to live, whether they want to rent or buy, and then try to satisfy that demand as well as they can. Bob Murphy has a YouTube, Mises, I think it's the Human Action Podcast. It's a discussion of this very thing. I've got a QR code at the very end and a series of links that will be available to you, including that Human Action Podcast. And Bob Murphy says, basically, this is like complaining about institutional buyers is sort of like complaining about used car dealerships buying up cars and holding them off the market. Well, yes, I mean, they are buying up cars and they are off the market for a brief period, or at least they're in some sort of inventory, but they are available for sale. And so the used car market is buying and selling, and to say that this is driving up prices for used car buyers is to miss half of what's going on. When the used car dealerships sell cars, they're making cars more available to people, and the same thing is happening with these institutional buyers. Also, this is not as big a part of the market as you might think. Large institutional investors hold about 3 to 4% of single-family rental stock, well under 2% of single-family homes. They're buying less than 2% of all homes. So it's kind of a red herring. It's not really the kind of single issue problem that people are suggesting. This is the market share of institutional purchases, and I don't know if you can see the vertical axis on this, but this is going from 0 up to 5%. So these are very small percentages here, and you can see that there was a blip here about 2022, 2021, 2022, 2023 in these institutional purchases, which kind of got everybody's attention. They started to make these claims that institutional buyers are the ones at fault. And no, that's not actually what's going on. You'll also see this. Well, boomers had it easy and then they ruined it for the rest of us. Well, in some ways, maybe so. And we'll get to some of that, but I think that too is more of a misconception. There is some confusion here about nominal housing prices. People look at just the price and they forget about things like the interest rate on mortgages. Yes, inflation has gone up a lot, but you really have to compare inflation to some other things that are happening, and so we'll talk about some of this. I'm going to throw some data at you in a minute. Housing quality has changed. An average house today is not your grandparents' house. The average house that people are building today is much bigger and has many more amenities than housing that was built maybe in the 80s or 60s or 40s. This is a chart from Jeremy Horpendahl from last fall, comparing housing that was built, single-family housing built in the 50s with housing built in the last few years. And I'll take you to the bottom of this table first and just ask you to look at the median square feet. In 1950, the median square feet was 1,150. That is a very small house by today's standards. So housing might have seemed cheaper in the 50s, partly because they were smaller. Not like today's housing. Median house today, well, 2024, was 2,200 square feet. All right, so houses are substantially larger, almost twice the size they were 70 years ago. Also, there are features that these houses have that they would not have had in the 1950s. A garage, which by my understanding does not count toward the square footage of a house because it's not typically heated, and they count heated square feet in measuring the size of houses. So garages are an important amenity. Things like insulation, having storm windows, central air and heating, dishwashers, garbage disposals, garage door openers, and the like. All of this is important so we're not making an apples to oranges kind of comparison of housing and in the past and housing today. Now, people are struck by this remarkable increase in prices, $14,500 versus over $400,000 as the median house price today. Again, we'll talk about some of the reasons that is as high as it is. But before we leave this, let's just look at the number of hours of work that a typical person making the average wage would have to work in order to buy 1 square foot of housing. And we see that has actually dropped just slightly between 1956 and today. In other words, you today would have to work about as long to buy a square foot of housing today as people would have in 1956. And that housing is going to be, in some regards, better because it's going to have things like central air and a garage and things like that we've talked about. I will also mention here that if you want to look at the intervening period between 1956 and 2026, we see things like, I dug up some stats on this. In 1960, 16.8% of houses in the United States, this is not new construction, this is just the housing stock. This is what people had available in the market. 16.8% of houses in the United States lacked complete plumbing facilities, meaning hot and cold piped water, a bathtub or shower, and a flush toilet. In 1970, that had dropped to 6.9%. By 1990, it was 1.1%. So the available housing stock was improving in just having basic things like plumbing. In 1950, by the way, that number was 35.5%. One-third of the housing, over one-third of the housing in the United States in 1950 did not have indoor plumbing, okay? So, again, we don't want to do an apples to oranges kind of comparison here. Housing affordability has not changed much if you look at a longer period of time. It has changed a good bit in the last several years, which again is why I think people are you're seeing a spike in concern and discussion about these things. But if you go back to 1979, which is the last earliest year on this chart, you see that 1 square foot of median new home takes 5.7 hours to work. Actually, 1971, we've got a single observation from then, 5 hours to work to get 1 square foot of median new home. 2023 is the last year on this chart, and that's 6.5 hours to work to get 1 square foot of housing. So, yeah, you can see some kind of localized increases, like from 5.1 in 2013, I think it's 2013, up to 6.8 in 2022. That's pretty substantial. But then also the 5.1 is kind of unusual given the last few decades. So that's also important to think about. Anytime you have a recession, that's going to tend to drive down housing prices. And so that's part of what's going on here. The post-recession period, after the 2008-2009 recession, you can see the drop in housing prices reflected in that increased affordability. But to try to say, well, you know, housing prices are a lot more expensive since 2013 is to kind of cherry pick when your starting point is. We don't want to do that. So this goes back a little further. This goes back to, well, not further than 1971, but it goes back to the period where the baby boomers are buying houses and people are saying, well, you know, boomers had it easy and so forth. Well, again, and I'm not a boomer. I may look like a boomer. I'm not. I'm Gen X, which everybody forgets about. So, oops, sorry. Wow, how did I skip ahead that far? All right, so there we go. This is a chart showing the Housing Affordability Index, which is whether the typical family earns enough to qualify for a mortgage on a median-priced single-family home. So this is going to include variables like the interest rate. You know, what are you going to have to pay for your mortgage, which is not just about the price of the house, it's also about the interest rate that you're going to be paying on that mortgage. And you can see that in the early 1980s, that affordability index was fairly low compared to even the last several years here where that, yes, affordability did drop substantially and sharply between about 2020, 2021, and today. But that simply brought us down to a level that was comparable to what you would have seen in the late 1980s. So we need to be sure that we're not just complaining about things that are not backed up by what's actually happening. The median home price has increased in recent years. But again, if you think about interest rates, thanks to the 1970s inflation, nominal interest rates were very high in the late 70s and early 80s. And you can see that here. Home prices not changed very much here in the 70s and 80s, but the affordability is affected by that relatively high interest rate during, mortgage rates during that time. Really sharp increases in house prices in the early 2000s. This is when the Federal Reserve is pumping money into the economy, and a lot of that is showing up in increased asset values, particularly in housing. This is the buildup to the housing crisis in 2007 that led into the recession of 2008, 2009. So this is the Fed increasing house prices by pumping money into the economy, and we see another increase here in 2021, 2022, 2023, same deal, right? So during the COVID period, the Fed's dramatically increasing the money supply, and a lot of that is showing up in higher house prices. So to the extent that we are seeing higher house prices, a lot of that is due to the Federal Reserve. And this is just to show the average rate on a 30-year fixed mortgage. I won't dwell on this, but just to show that in the early 1980s, I guess it would be your grandparents who were buying houses during that period of time. Most of your, I'm guessing on your age, but most of you would be your grandparents buying houses would be facing very high nominal interest rates because of this inflation from the Federal Reserve. So, how much do people spend on their shelter? And this is not just housing in terms of single-family housing, this is also apartments. How much are people spending out of their household income on shelter? And that is not, as you can see, changing very much. About 25% of their household income in 1964. A little bit less than that in 2024. Not a whole lot of change in that regard. Also, it's important when we try to think about intergenerational changes here, how well did the boomers do? How well did Gen X do? How well are the millennials doing? And Gen Z, of course. We need to think about what they're earning, right? So this is from 2024. This is showing how much different generations were earning at different stages of their life. And you can see that the Gen Zers right here at their current age are earning approximately what boomers began earning in their 40s. Okay? So that's important to keep in mind. You are better off in that sense. Now, there are some caveats to that. There are some things that boomers got for free, essentially, that you might end up having to pay for. One of those that comes to mind that I saw a Substack last week on was public schooling. Public schooling has, I would suggest, declined substantially in quality since boomers were sending their kids to school and since they themselves went to school. So that means that part of this higher income that you're earning may end up having to go to paying to get in a private school the kind of education that earlier generations might have been able to get from a public school. So there is that, and I won't spend more time on that point, but that is a valid concern. So it's not just about the dollars, in other words. There are other things that do affect your standard of living. Square feet. I mentioned earlier that the typical house in 1956 was 1,150 square feet. Today it's more than twice that. Houses are getting larger. Now that is partly because of people's preferences, but also because of increased incomes, increased affordability of what you can buy with your income. But household sizes are shrinking as well. So an 1,100 square foot house in 1960 would have typically had more people in it. Family sizes were larger. That is the literal baby boom during that period. So you did have a lot of kids in houses. And today you have people that may be living in a house by themselves, or maybe two people or three. Family sizes have shrunk, but house Square footage has increased, so we have more square footage per person, which is another variable we need to think about. So, having said all of this, I'm not denying that there are some real problems with housing affordability. So I want to go through some of those with you. And the first one is inflation. I mentioned this briefly. The Federal Reserve has driven up house prices, nominal house prices through inflation. We saw that sharp increase in the early 2020s. Median sales prices of houses are about twice what they were at the end of the 2008-2009 recession. That is not your imagination, and that is largely because the money supply is higher. It's approximately 3 times what it was just those few years ago. So what's that, 17, 18 years ago now. Since fall 2023, house price indexes and M2, that's our most commonly used measure of the money supply, have moved in opposite directions. I've got a chart to show you that in a minute. But inflation does not affect everyone equally. The mainstream economists tend to treat inflation as though it's just money that's flowing evenly into everyone's bank accounts all at the same time, and that it's kind of leveling out, increasing like water in a bucket, and that's not the case. We know that there are Cantillon effects. Austrian economists have emphasized this very important difference in how inflation affects some groups as opposed to how it affects other groups. And so some assets will track inflation better than others. Stocks historically have tracked inflation better than the interest rate on your bank account, for example. Real estate tends to track inflation a little better than other assets, and that's part of the reason we see these higher nominal house prices in the last several years. However, first-time home buyers, and that's going to be some of you in the next few years, I hope, maybe. But first-time home buyers are those who tend to have more of their assets in cash that does not track inflation as well. So people who are trying to buy their first home may not have assets that have tracked inflation up to the point where they're ready to buy their house. Whereas people who are already in houses are watching those prices, the nominal prices of their homes increase, as well as their stock portfolios. So that is an important consideration. This is that chart I promised you. This is M2 as the green line here, and you can see that in the last several years, that's increased. The COVID and post-COVID inflation is visible here in the sharp increase in M2 in 2020 through about 2022. And then the Federal Reserve decided to try to hit the brakes, relatively speaking, and that's the little decline that you see here about, I guess, 2023, 24. So what's happened to house prices in the last several years, we've gotten a little bit of relief on that, but that sharp increase here in the early 2020s is tracking with that increase in M2. In general, housing is a lot like other goods where government has had a lot to do with the market, either subsidizing it in some way or constraining the supply in some way. And so you'll notice that the goods, the classes of goods that have gotten more expensive the fastest are those where government has a very heavy hand of intervention in the market. So we see hospital services, government's providing huge quantities or huge percentages of this market, college tuition and fees, college textbooks, childcare, medical care services, housing, and food and beverages. So the areas where you've seen prices decline have been areas where the government is less involved, and so things like TVs and cell phone services, computer software, we see actually declining prices over time. Second, higher interest rates. So for the Fed to try to deal with the inflation it had created in 2020 through 2022, it had to increase rates, and we saw that the M2 money supply increased dramatically in that period of time. House prices went up rapidly. They didn't quite keep up with that 40% rate, but they did increase. If you raise rates, that's going to mean that loans are more expensive. Prices have been slow to decline. You saw some of that decline in the last several years in the previous chart. Higher prices, higher rates mean higher costs of buying a house, since you are typically taking out a mortgage to buy a house. Edward Pinto and Joseph Tracy, in the article that I had mentioned earlier, say that from 2019 to 2024, the median first-time buyer income needed to purchase a home increased by 41% nationally, about 4 times the rate of median U.S. household income growth. So again, it's not your imagination that it is more expensive for younger generations to buy a house. This is total house cost with a 30-year fixed mortgage, and you can see that rapid increase from 2022 forward, and a slight decrease since then, but not very much. Third, I'll move quickly here since I'm running out of time. But I do think that the zoning issue is very important in trying to understand what's happening with house prices, especially over the long term. So governments, especially at the local level, will try to restrict housing supply deliberately. And if you think about it, there is a political reason for this. House owners want the value of the home that they're occupying to rise because it's making them wealthier. Home buyers, however, who are not currently in a house, want those prices to be lower. So if the home owners have the ability to influence local politics and put in place these restrictive zoning rules that prevent people from building houses as rapidly as they otherwise would, you're constraining the supply and you're preventing the price of housing from falling. So restricting that supply as zoning does, and you might even say that that is the primary purpose of zoning, is to restrict the supply, that will raise prices. Now people will say, well, you know, I like zoning because it means that a factory is not going to plunk down next to my house that I just built, and nobody really wants to live next to a factory. And so that's why we need zoning, they say. Well, this is too much to get into a lot of this today, but a lot of that is kind of a fabricated mythology about zoning and what it actually accomplishes. But it's very clear that zoning does increase house prices. Some of the zoning rules have to do with the lot size restrictions. If the government can say, well, you can't build a single-family home unless it's on a lot size that is large, you're essentially restricting the supply of new housing. If you limit additions to housing, maybe you want to build on an addition or put a separate building behind your house for a relative to live in for a while, some of these restrictions will prevent you from doing this, which is tantamount to restricting the supply. Historic ordinances that say you can't build, or you can't build in a certain way in this neighborhood because it's historic and therefore we want to preserve the aesthetic of this neighborhood, that too is doing the same thing. Subdivision regulations that try to impose design and infrastructure requirements on builders. I mentioned historic district ordinances, rules that prevent the conversion of land from wetlands, and by the way, what you think of as a wetland is not necessarily a wetland. Wetlands can actually be pretty dry a good bit of the time. So there's what the government considers a wetland, and then there's what common sense would tell you is a wetland. Converting from agricultural land to housing, also there are restrictions on this. Growth controls that are trying to prevent more housing from being built as an aggregate rather than simply directing it in some sort of central planning method of allocating resources. Now, I would object to the central planning of housing development, but some of the development restrictions are not just about saying we want housing here instead of there. Some of it is we want less housing overall, and that will definitely drive up housing. This was a study from earlier this year from Jason Sorens at AIER, who showed that if you have stricter zoning, and a lot of this is county ordinances, so he looked at counties, if you see higher or more intervention in zoning, more restrictions in zoning, you're going to see higher house prices in those counties. I mentioned minimum lot sizes. There have been some studies on this. Again, my QR code at the end will give you a link to some of these studies, but minimum lot size zoning delays the conversion of vacant land, so restricts development again. Doubling minimum lot sizes increases home sales prices by 14%, increases rents by 9%. So again, if you want to know why it's hard to find a house, a lot of this has to do with zoning. Now, there have been some limited efforts to roll back zoning restrictions, and one of those was in Minneapolis in 2018, when it became the first U.S. city to eliminate single-family zoning with an idea that they were going to improve housing affordability. And one study here from earlier this year, it was the revision, showed that reform reduced the growth of housing costs over the subsequent 5 years, with home prices being 16 to 34% lower than if they had not rolled back these zoning restrictions, according to their estimates. Green zones. So some cities say, well, we don't want development to convert forest land and wilderness land or agricultural land outside the city. We don't want this urban sprawl to take what we think is scenic land and turn it into more housing. And so you see some cities that establish these green zones on the outskirts of town, and the result of this is not so much that people are moving back into the central city, which that restriction would tend to drive up prices in the central city, but also it promotes this kind of leapfrog development where people move to towns outside of that green zone. But one thing is very clear, and that is that this increases the prices of housing inside the city center and promotes more of that development outside the green area, the green belt, or whatever they want to call that green zone. You can see this around the city of Toronto over a period of a couple of decades where that green zone has increased. More restrictions over time. 3 days ago, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal on London's problems with housing. There are numerous groups that have the ability to put the brakes on new housing programs or housing construction. So one developer was trying to take a block of East London and build about 80 new homes in that, as well as some retail space. And developers tried to get the city authorities to approve this, and over 4 years and 9,000 pages of submitted documents, they were unable to get the city to approve even just these 80 homes, and they need a lot more than that. One of the reasons for their denial of permission here was that 2 old office buildings dating back probably to the 1950s or 60s would have to be demolished. A lot of the rebuilding of London after World War II involved these 1950s and 60s style buildings. Well, we certainly wouldn't want to tear those down, would we? But that has meant that their target, and again, this is central planning, but we'll use it as a ballpark, this increase of 88,000 homes that the city says they need, they got only about 4,000 far, far, far less. Now you contrast that to Auckland, New Zealand, which made their planning rules much more flexible about 10 years ago, and that decreased rents and home prices over the next 10 years. Vancouver, British Columbia, began to see increases in housing development. Austin, Texas, which loosened its planning system, is building at a rapid pace compared to London. And certainly, if you see this kind of opportunity to restrict or to roll back these zoning restrictions, then you'll tend to see improvements in housing affordability. Number 4 is banking regulations. Because of Dodd-Frank rules that were established after the 2008-2009 recession, there are some pretty high fixed costs on mortgages, which means that banks don't want to make small mortgages. They're less profitable for banks. In 2019, a Wall Street Journal report said that low-end borrowers had their applications denied at a higher rate than those taking out bigger mortgages, even when comparing borrowers with similar credit quality. It's not just that people buying smaller houses have worse credit. It's that banks don't want to make those kinds of loans. Furthermore, community banks, which typically catered to this market of smaller mortgages for smaller houses, were shut down in large numbers by the Dodd-Frank regulations. So Dodd-Frank, which was supposedly about trying to make banking more stable and improving the reliability of our banking system, actually ended up being an anti-competitive kind of move on the part of the federal government. Over 3,600 community banks, according to Craig Richardson, closed between 2010 and I think his writing was in 2025. So a dramatic reduction in exactly the kind of banking that was making loans to people buying smaller houses. So it's no surprise that builders are not building smaller houses because banks aren't giving out the mortgages for these smaller houses because Dodd-Frank discouraged them from doing so. Connor O'Keefe has an article on Mises Wire, I think this was from either earlier this year or late last year, on 50-year mortgages, which were kind of floated as an opportunity to bring housing prices down. And he pointed out, I think insightfully and correctly, that this is not going to improve things. It's just going to drive up demand, driving up prices. And we could say also, why would government have anything to say about what the term of a house mortgage should be, whether that should be 15 or 30 or 50 years? Why is this a matter for government to concern itself with? Number 5, you may have seen some claims that immigration has affected house prices. And I was actually surprised to see some indications that this was a large effect, at least in some local markets. One study from earlier this year showed that unauthorized immigrant worker flows, that's UIWF in their paper, explains about 30% of the total increase in house prices and about 20% of the total increase in rents. Now, it is important to keep in mind, and they show this in their paper, that this varies tremendously across different local areas, and real estate, of course, is very sensitive to these local rules and local variables. So if you have some cities that tend to be attracting a lot of immigrants, then you're going to see more of an impact in housing prices in those areas. I kind of wonder offhand if that might be why Minneapolis decided to roll back some of their zoning restrictions to try to improve housing affordability, because they may have been more affected by that immigrant inflow than other places. Last, I think this is last on my, yes, last is Airbnb. What about the Airbnb effect? So you'll see a lot of, in local areas that have maybe a tourist destination quality to them, a lot of homeowners will turn their home into short-term rentals, at least for a brief period of time during the year, maybe the tourist season. Maybe the local owner goes somewhere else and rents out their place on Airbnb for a while. And this generates some animosity sometimes among the neighbors who may not like to have partying tourists next door and maybe a lot of traffic and people who don't understand where they need to park and so forth. So you get a lot of these kinds of kind of complaints about Airbnb from neighbors. But what about the change in the house prices? The critics here will argue that home sharing platforms like Airbnb raise the cost of living for local renters because now they're having to compete with out-of-towners who are coming in to rent short-term. Local landlords, non-resident tourists do benefit from these kinds of things. There have been some studies on this, many of them actually. I picked one here to show you from Kyle Barron and Edward Kung and David Proserpio from 2021, where they found that a 1% increase in Airbnb listings is associated with about a 0.018% increase in rents and a comparable increase in house prices. They show that this accounts for about 1/5 of actual rent growth and about 1/7 of actual price growth. So that's part of what's going on. However, we have to think about not just the effect on the local renters. We have to think about if you're looking at affordability more broadly, how is this affecting affordability? If you've got Airbnb as an option as a traveler or as a tourist, this is improving affordability. So we can't really say that Airbnb is decreasing affordability unless we're sort of selecting one part of the market to look at, just the effect on local renters who now must compete with these out-of-towners. You have to also think about affordability for people who want temporary housing while they are on vacation. So unless you're trying to systematically favor these local residents over people who might be on vacation, we have no real basis for saying that this is diminishing affordability in a broader sense. So you allow people to use this otherwise vacant space in their home to compete with the Marriott and the Best Western and so forth, and this is going to improve the affordability for the short-term renters. And the people who rent some of their house space on Airbnb may find that they now have an increased income that helps them to afford the houses that they are living in for perhaps a part of the year. So, in the same way, if I buy coffee where it's cheaper and sell it where it's more expensive, we wouldn't say that that's creating an affordability problem here. But if you use government to try to restrict Airbnb, as some local governments have tried to do, this will tend to lower home values for everyone, increasing affordability for people who would like to buy and live in residences or rent long-term, while decreasing affordability for tourists. Well, I'm out of time, but I'll give you my QR code for any resources you might like, and I've got the PDF of all the slides there. Thank you very much.
Done any like dance program?
I've heard this street dance, but it's not as good as like what you were doing.
Oh, just like this was
It's
impressive?
just like, I don't know.
Okay. That's fine.
Eles começam, aí tem toda uma filosofia, os caras.
We're ready? Okay. Okay, good morning. Day 3 of Mises U. This is when you start to feel and understand the importance of pacing yourselves at night and getting good sleep and coming in ready, especially when I'm going to be talking in the morning. So today I'm going to talk to you about repugnant markets. Alvin Roth won the Nobel Prize in 2012 for his work in what he called market design. And he said his aim in market design is to, quote, know the workings and requirements of particular markets well enough to fix them when they're broken or to build markets from scratch when they're missing. So in other words, when there's market failure, somebody clever like Alvin Roth needs to come in and come to the rescue with some fancy, complicated solution. We're going to talk about one of Roth's solutions in a little bit. But one of the cases he says where market design is needed is when the good exchange in that market is considered morally repugnant, which is the topic of our session today. Ross says that some transactions are repugnant in some times and places, and that can change over time, becoming more or less repugnant, just as there are changes in the culture. But some examples of repugnant markets that he cites include eating horse or dog meat, slavery, sex work, lending at interest, narcotics. Mark Thornton did a lot of work in that, pollution permits, and then my favorite, dwarf tossing. So dwarf tossing is a sport where men compete, mostly men. I have seen a video of a woman tossing, but where men compete to see who can throw a little person the farthest. So I have most of you are probably innocent and have never been in establishments where they do this kind of thing. So I have a kind of cleaned up PG video clip for you so you can see what's going on.
When I go, I put on the helmet, I put on the harness. I am the superhero for the night. I'm Mighty Mike Murga, and I'm the mini man behind the dwarf tossing extravaganza.
Okay, so the Little People of America, the LPA, they condemn the sport. They say it's dehumanizing. They claim it's the objectification of, quote, individuals with dwarfism. So the LPA actively campaigns against dwarf tossing, and they call for its prohibition. We need to stop this immediately. But our question is, who's it harming? Yes, for the little person, there's a certain amount of indignity, and there's also probably a risk of injury in either the tossing or the landing. But it seems that Mighty Mike Murga in the video, Mighty Mike Murga understands Rothbard's claim that the only rights that make sense are property rights, right? He says even and he probably even understands the principle of self-ownership. Mighty Mike Murga says, this is a quote, "It's my body, I can do with it what I want. People love to throw a midget. I'm just friggin' good at it." He goes on to say, "Hey, you want to throw a little person? Pay me a few bucks, now's your chance." He emphasized, "I'm asking you to throw me for a little reimbursement." But Mighty Mike is not without principle. He says, but I do it as a sport. So I want to point out, it may seem crass, and most of these things do happen in strip clubs, but most of these are in strip clubs. It seems crass, but it is a serious sport, and the toss distances are measured with precision by legit judges. So I want you to check out the keen discernment of this judge. So I need to click again to make the video play.
Some midgets.
8.5 feet, he calls out, but wait a minute. Why does this guy look so familiar? Is that Ryan McMakin? Okay, so first, the resemblance is uncanny. I ask Ryan about this later. Okay, so first I want to dispense with the stupid argument against repugnant markets, like horse meat or dwarf tossing, and then we'll get to some more substantive arguments against repugnant markets by Roth and other people. So the first one is the market produces gross stuff. Okay, that's the stupid objection that dwarf tossing is gross. You'll hear something like this: "I hate free markets or capitalism because you end up with stuff like dwarf tossing, and that's just gross. You'll have nasty brutes throwing little people for entertainment, and they're a bad influence. They're going to get other people, other innocent, good-natured people to enjoy the objectification of midgets." Okay, so as Tom Woods would say, well, how can we ever overcome that argument? Well, first, dwarf tossing could be produced in socialism. There's plenty of gross stuff under socialism, right? It could be produced under socialism or any other system. The advantage of capitalism is that in markets, we have the exact amount, right, of gross stuff that's preferred by consumers. It's going to be determined, the amount of gross stuff we have, just like the amount of classy stuff we have is determined through the profit and loss system. Okay. Second, any lowbrow or distasteful good that's produced in a market economy is not a knock on capitalism itself. Right? So remember from Peter Klein's lecture on Monday, the successful entrepreneur is the one who's best at anticipating and producing what the consumers want. Okay, so here I'm not emphasizing the action of the entrepreneur so much as the fact that he's anticipating producing what the consumers want. Okay, whether that is repugnant or classy. Okay, so in anti-capitalistic mentality, Mises wrote despairingly of the popularity of what he called detective stories. And he went on to say, but it's not the fault of capitalism that common man does not appreciate uncommon books, right? So we can't expect what's produced in the market to be any more moral or highbrow than, or elite than the actors in the market. Here's a quote from Edmund Oppett says, "The inherent frailties and shortcomings of the market follow from a definition of it. The market consists of people in free, voluntary exchange of goods, services, and ideas. It follows, therefore, that the market will exhibit every shortcoming men exhibit in their thinking and peaceful acting, for in the broadest sense, it is nothing else but that." Right? It's just people voluntarily acting, exchanging, and so we can't have anything better than what those people would prefer. Walter Block says that the market is the best means for providing the satisfaction for consumers' wants, and we all agree with that. As Walter would say, pity the poor fool, I'm not fool, that's Mr. T. Walter said, pity the poor souls not fortunate enough to live in free markets. However, what some consumers want will pay for in the market are goods whose moral status are at best questionable, right? And in many cases, we might consider them immoral. But Walter said, and this is from Defending the Undefendable, the free enterprise system thus cannot be considered a moral one. Rather, as a means of consumer satisfaction, it can only be as moral as are the goals of the market participants themselves. Since these vary widely, all the way from completely depraved and immoral to the entirely legitimate, the market must be seen as amoral, neither moral, oh, there's a typo, neither moral nor immoral. Okay, so in markets, we see preferences of the economic actors are revealed, but markets don't impose preferences. And so just the preferences of the people in the market, we are seeing them revealed. So now that we have the stupid objection out of the way, let's get to some of the more substantive objections from the literature, starting with Roth. So these are some slightly better objections to allowing trade in these repugnant goods. First, the markets won't be sufficiently thick. Buyers and sellers in these markets won't feel safe revealing their preferences about these goods. And trading in these morally offensive goods presents a negative externality. And we'll go through these one at a time, starting with the thickness argument. These markets are not going to be sufficiently thick enough. So sufficiently thick. So this is the charge here by Roth is that markets will fail because there won't be a large enough number of buyers and sellers to produce, quote, satisfactory outcomes on both sides of the transaction. Okay, so this is basically a fear that the buyer or the seller has some kind of, some degree of market power, either a monopsony where there's a single buyer or a monopoly where there's a single seller. Now, yesterday from Professor Fegley's lecture, we learned that we don't need to be worried about market power and this problem of monopoly because, first of all, we can say all voluntary transactions are at least ex ante mutually beneficial. People enter into these exchanges expecting to be better off. So we don't need an arbitrary number of buyers or sellers and also we don't need to declare anything about the outcome of the transaction, Alvin Roth, because both parties entered into the transaction voluntarily. So we have plenty of examples of this. One is, what if there's only one living master artist who paints in a particular style? He's the only one who paints like this. And then there's also only one homeowner who is quirky enough to say, I want this huge mural, in my 2-story entryway wall. I want this huge mural in that particular style. So we only have one buyer and one seller. So this market is not thick at all, right? To Alvin Roth and others, they would say, this is a hindrance. To me, sounds like a match made in heaven. I mean, we got one buyer, one seller, they can get together and exchange. So what if there's only one seller and many buyers? What if there's many sellers and only one buyer? This is still not a problem because markets can allocate scarce resources to those who value them the highest. So Roth says that economic actors in repugnant markets won't feel safe. They won't feel safe in revealing information on their preferences about these goods that are repugnant. Okay? But the cost of revealing your preference for the good, the cost of whatever that embarrassment is you feel or shame for wanting this good, the cost of that is already taken into account in your subjective preference, right? When in your subjective preference ranking. So remember Mighty Mike Murga. He's going to be embarrassed. He's being tossed. He weighs the risk of not just insult, but also injury, and he still chose to be tossed. So another example of this is back in the 1980s and 90s even, 80s and 90s, when you wanted to watch a movie that was not currently showing either on HBO or one movie at a time on HBO, right? For everybody theaters, you had to go to the Blockbuster or some video rental place, and you had to go and get the video and take it back to your home to watch it. So, what if I went into Blockbuster to get a video of, My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic? And that's what I went there for. I wanted to get that. I was really needing some My Little Pony. And I get there and what if super hot guy from school is working at the video counter? So now I have to decide, what do I value more? The enjoyment I get from watching My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, or the good opinion of the hot guy at Blockbuster, right? So the fear of revealing that information is already calculated into my subjective value preference ranking when I act, right? So if many video renters fear judgment from getting My Little Pony, that's all the better for me, because then maybe it'll rent it, the price will fall, lower demand, I'll be getting My Little Pony at a discount. So, by the way, Peter told me, he said, hey, don't put my picture in every single one of your Mises Institute slide decks. So, of course, I had to go Sophie Cunningham on him and put it, and he's in there. He's in all of them. Okay, so, okay. Others will argue that allowing for trades in certain goods is morally offensive to some people, and so this becomes a negative externality. And they'll say these trades shouldn't be allowed because of this negative externality. It's pretty obvious just from looking around the world, maybe not here at the Mises Institute, but just you go out here and you walk a few blocks and you can tell pretty quickly that we don't all agree on what's moral and good, right? So take, for example, pineapple on pizza. Talk about the market producing gross stuff. Some of y'all weirdos really love it, but the rest of us normal people, we hate it. We hate it. That gets gross. So even though we may correctly believe that pineapple on pizza is an abomination, we shouldn't be able to force our superior taste on the rest of the world and everyone else. So let's make an extreme case. Let's say that 95% of the population hates pineapple on pizza. Say this 10 times fast. Pineapple on pizza. Say that 95% of the population hates pineapple on pizza so much that just the thought of it makes us, sick, makes us throw up, and it's a negative externality. However, negative externalities do not call for state action. We don't need state prohibition, because if the action was truly harmful and violated property rights, it could be addressed through private legal system. So you thinking about someone eating pineapple on pizza does not violate anybody's property rights. It might offend you, but you can simply abstain from consuming it yourself. So the problem with banning the sale of goods, difference agreement. The problem with banning the sale of goods that are deemed inappropriate in some way, even morally repugnant, is the near inevitability of subjective dislike by at least one person, right? Anything that comes up, even My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, somebody may find that morally repugnant and say, I can't stand the thought of anybody watching that, so it has to be banned, right? Inevitably, there's going to be at least one Karen out there who's going to say, I object. So it would mean that there would be really no sense of freedom at all. So here's an Italian-American immigrant is held and forced to watch in horror as pineapple is added to pizza for the first time, 1914, Brooklyn, New York. So broadening the definition of harm beyond objective property rights violations leads to a situation where virtually all action could be prohibited by someone, right? Someone could object to no matter what it is. So that would make meaningful freedom or any productive activity impossible. So I want to be clear and say that I'm not going to patronize dwarf tossing. I'm not going to start eating horse meat or pineapple on pizza. So the defense of these repugnant markets is a limited one, right? It is limited to saying that these activities do not involve aggression, and that does not mean that I'm saying they are moral or praiseworthy. So my time remaining, I want to discuss one particular repugnant market that Alvin Roth has come up with a very complicated solution, and his solution is still not perfect. It's still problematic, but that market is allowing legal markets for transplantable kidneys, or I would say even for all organs that can be used in transplants. We're going to talk mostly about kidneys because that's where the bulk of the research has been done in having markets for these organs. But there are lots of different organs that have been transplanted successfully. Kidneys have been done the most. Others that have been transplanted include heart transplant. There's actually a good movie, if you like rom-com, there's not even more dramedy, but a drama called Return to Me, where there was a heart transplant, starred David Duchovny. So anyway, liver, lung, intestines, pancreas, cornea. There has not been a successful full eye transplant yet. They have done a full eye transplant, but the guy can't see. So that didn't work, but they have transplanted cornea successfully. In 2005, we had the first whole face transplant that stuck and worked. The one that gives me nightmares is the hand transplant. The first one was done successfully in 1998. It was from a man on death row in prison. They took his hand and they put it on somebody else that's not in prison, and it stuck and it worked, and they could get to where the recipient could make the hand flex and do all these things. That gives me nightmares. I would want to know, was he in prison for violent crime? Did he choke anybody? That's what I would worry about. Okay, so a little bit about the history of kidney transplants. The first one was performed in 1954 from a living donor to his identical twin brother. Okay. Initially, organ transplants were limited to living donors, taking it out of a living person and putting it in someone else. And the supply, because of that, was based solely on altruism, right? At the time, this seemed appropriate, altruistic supply, where the personal affection for your family member was the motivation for donating a kidney. Then in 1983, almost 30 years later, immunosuppressant drugs were approved for transplant surgeries. What that did was it prevented the person receiving the kidney from rejecting it. And that made these drugs made more organ transplants possible from both living donors and from cadavers. So because these new medications, it was feasible to use kidneys from donors who were deceased and anonymous not a family member, not your friend, that's a match, but anonymous donors to the recipient. So it no longer required familial affection. Naturally, because of this now, demand for transplants grew. But the next year, in 1984, 1 year later, the National Organ Transplant Act made it a felony to buy or sell cadaveric organs for transplant. So essentially, this carried over the procurement policy from this earlier period of living and related donors, even though it was unnecessary with these new drugs. But the altruistic supply was locked into place. And instead of rationally allocating scarce cadaveric kidneys through the price system, now they're allocated by waiting. Okay, people are on a waiting list. The average wait time for a kidney is about 5 years, but that's probably less accurate because some people are taken off the list because their health deteriorates while they are doing the waiting. And some people are actually never qualified. They're never allowed on the list. So that 5 years really understates it. People on waiting lists report they have low rates of employment and there's significant deterioration of their quality of life. For people waiting for a kidney, so the kidney performs this function, the renal function is filtering impurities and toxins out of your body, out of your bloodstream. Well, they have to now be on dialysis, a machine that does this for them. The number of hours they have to spend hooked up to the dialysis machine varies depending on their degree of renal failure that they are suffering. So some just go for a couple of hours, 2 to 3 days a week, and some of them are on dialysis a lot more. So banning the sale of organs was effectively setting a price ceiling at 0. So remember price ceilings from yesterday from Joe Salerno's talk. The expected result of a binding price ceiling would be a what? A shortage, right? And so a shortage is what we have. So no price controls are desirable or good. This one seems particularly nasty and pernicious to me, though, because we have people suffering and often dying because of this price control. So often when there's a price ceiling instituted, and Professor Salerno mentioned this yesterday, black markets will emerge. But in this case, when you're talking about cut me open and either take my kidney out or cut me open and put somebody else's kidney in, people are not as willing to submit to that under black market conditions, right? So the shortage is getting worse. From 1990 to 2021, the percentage of people on the waiting list who received a kidney transplant declined from 55% in 1990. 55% of the people on the waiting list got a kidney transplant in 1990 to only 27% in 2021. So the gap is widening. And instead of the most obvious solution to a shortage and allowing markets to perform the function of allocating these transplantable organs, here's what's been suggested. So here are some non-market solutions that people have said, oh, we should do this to alleviate the shortage. Education campaigns to encourage people to sign donor cards. So you sign on a lot of times I think when you go get your driver's license, there's a place where you can indicate, if I die in an accident, I'm willing to have you harvest my organs. Okay, there has been some stuff lately that I've read about in the last year or two. This is a bad idea because there is a definition of brain dead that is kind of loosey-goosey. It's not a for sure thing. It requires some judgment on behalf of the surgeon there in the ER. So some people are saying I wasn't brain dead. They took my kidney or my liver or whatever. Also, taxpayer-funded reimbursement of explicit costs to living donors. So you say, I have 2 kidneys, I can live with just one, my sister needs a kidney, I will donate my kidney to my sister, but, that means I'm gonna have to have time off work. I'm gonna have to maybe have to travel to the state where my sister is. And those are some real costs for me. And so the idea is let's raise the cost to the organ donors from a negative price, their costs. Let's compensate for that. So from negative to up to zero, make it flush so that they can do this. So to me, this sounds like they do agree with law of supply, that it applies to organ donation as well, but they just won't allow it in this particular case. So the next one is Ross market design, and I want to talk about this a little bit more. So his market design for a kidney exchange is basically a long, complex chain of incompatible living donors and recipient pairs. So, for example, if you have two pairs of people, A and B and C and D, person A is willing to donate a kidney to his friend B, and person C is willing to donate a kidney to their relative D, okay? But what happens if they're not matches? If A's kidney does not match B and C's doesn't match D? Ross said we can create a chain where A matches D and donates a kidney, thinking that C will then donate a kidney to B. Okay, so the problem is, what if C's kidney doesn't match B? Now, maybe B has to moonwalk to get a kidney. I don't know. So, but my point is that Roth's market design here looks a lot like a double coincidence of wants, right? That's essentially what it is. But Roth's idea is, well, we'll get more and more people, more and more of these unmatched pairs, incompatible pairs to contribute. The hope is that if you have one person who's willing to donate a kidney because you need one, eventually in the chain, in this big pool of people, there will be somebody whose kidney would match with yours. And by the way, Roth's whole market design is involving living donors, where there's definitely some costs and risk to the donor giving them. So we all agree that markets are the best way to allocate scarce resources, even for something like kidneys. Let's look at, what do we think this market would actually look like? And this is something where we're going to have to use our imagination, right? We haven't seen this, but remember, it's 20 years ago, in many of your lifetimes, marijuana sales were not legal, and now they are. And so we can use our imagination and try to think and consider, what would this market look like maybe? So first, I want to specify that I'm talking about cadaveric kidneys. These are kidneys out of dead bodies. A lot of times these are from people who died in accidents. They didn't suffer from cancer for a long time, and so their body had chemotherapy and all that. No, these are usually from people who died tragically young, and so they have healthy organs. So I'm going to be talking about cadaveric kidneys, but of course this was also work for living donors as well. But some people believe that if we allow the sale of cadaveric kidneys, then the need for any living donors would go away. That it could all be satisfied by kidneys from dead people. So we should note that the demand for kidneys is a derived demand. It's a factor of production in the transplant operation. And so what we're really demanding is the improved health that we get from having functioning kidney that will perform for us. So that is what we're really demanding, and the kidney is derived from that demand. Okay, so we expect the demand for kidneys, cadaveric kidneys, is probably very inelastic. Two reasons. One is there are really no close substitutes for for the vital function that your kidneys perform. There is dialysis, but dialysis is not as great as having a kidney that when you wake up in the morning, you get out of bed, wherever you go, your kidneys go with you, right? So dialysis, you have to be hooked to a machine. You sit in a recliner next to the machine, takes your blood out into the machine, performs a function, puts the blood back in you. So not as good of not a great substitute. Also, there are risks of infection, high rates of depression for people on dialysis. The other reason is that renal function is a necessity, right? If we don't have it, then we get sick and can die actually from kidney failure. So that's two reasons why we expect that the demand for kidneys, cadaveric kidneys, would probably be fairly inelastic. Now, inelastic means that when the price rises, the price can rise a whole lot, and your quantity demanded is only going to change a tiny bit, right? Or maybe not at all, even with the huge rise in price. Now, you may look at that and you say, Sandy, these people are suffering and they have very inelastic demand. You're going to allow markets in this where these people could just be completely taken advantage of, right? They're in a desperate situation. You want to make them pay for their kidney. Well, yes, because then they have a better chance of getting a kidney. But the reason why, the key why this market would work is because we think supply is probably very elastic, meaning that with a small increase in price, we can get a big response in the quantity of a small increase in price will give us a big increase in the quantity supplied of cadaveric kidneys. Now, Murray Rothbard, he took a total revenues approach to elasticity. He said elasticity of supply is not a meaningful concept because whenever the price rises, total revenue is going to go in the same direction. I'm using it in this case here, just saying that we expect that people would be very responsive to a change in price, and there would be a huge increase in the number of kidneys supplied to the market when the price is allowed to rise from zero to whatever the market price would be. Okay, so why do we think that the supply of cadaveric kidneys would be very elastic? Why do we believe it'd be very elastic? Well, first, surveys have been done of families who show families of accident victims, and what would you have thought if you had been asked? Would you have been willing to allow the ER doctors to harvest the kidneys or other organs out of your loved one's body? And families indicated they would have been willing. And so the question is, well, why weren't the organs harvested? And maybe it's that there was no financial incentive for somebody to go in there to do the hard job of asking, right? Because can you imagine that's your job? And in a market, we think there would be somebody who could do this in a tasteful way, but their 9-year-old son was riding his bike, he just got hit by a car, and now I have to go in and not only say, I'm sorry, he didn't make it, and now can we take his kidneys? That would just be the worst thing. But anyway, but if there's some financial incentive to do so and to ask in the right way, then maybe that would be done. Also, excess capacity. We have a large number of transplantable organs that are just being buried with the cadaver and the body's completely intact. So it would be very easy at a low cost to start harvesting some of those for transplant. So entrepreneurs have an incentive to facilitate the mutually beneficial exchange of kidneys in creative and innovative ways. Right? We don't know what the market will look like, but again, we can imagine third-party third-party organ procurement firms maybe would arise. We would have people who specialize in their division, the Division of Labor, they specialize in being able to ask, they're trained in grief counseling, they know how to approach the families in this, the worst day of their life. They know how to approach the family in a tasteful way. There could be both forward markets where some of your grandparents or maybe your parents have already done this. They've got their funeral already planned. They're living, they're well, they're totally fine, not expecting to die today, but they've already bought and taken care of all the funeral arrangements, right? The same could be where you enter into a contract with some procurement firm and say, when I die, you can take my organs for transplant. Or there could also be, they could also be spot markets where just on the spot, then they go in, the young child dies and they go in an accident and they go and talk to the families to ask them if they would allow the organs to be harvested. But it's reasonable to expect that a person will be willing to enter into a contract to accept compensation for the removal of your kidney at the time of your death, right? That's reasonable to expect that. Pay me $50 now, $500 now, I don't know what it would be. Pay that now, and then when I die, y'all can have my kidneys because I'm not gonna need them then, right? That seems like that would be a reasonable thing to expect that people are willing to do. So it may end up that the price of the cadaveric kidneys may be well within the reach of what your church could raise for you in a rummage sale, or you could get your friends to donate in a GoFundMe. So where is this being done? Currently, we have markets for kidneys in Iran. Now, this is not where the first place we think of, I want to emulate their economic policies, right? That's not what we think of necessarily with Iran. But in this case, they have some good ideas. So Iran's kidney market is very regulated. It's far from perfect, but still we can see how's it working? Would this work here? Big one, first of all, they have no waiting list. It says a kidney market, this is from a study in Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, Hippen said a kidney market with payment eliminates shortages. And the Iranian model proves it. It appears that even a small monetary incentive would lead to substantial increase in the procurement rates of cadaveric kidneys and other organs. So we're convinced that a market for kidneys could work economically. It just sounds like a good idea. So Mark Thornton, as I said, has done a lot of work in this. He has a book called Economics of Prohibition, where he did all of this for drugs. And he argues for the legalization of not just marijuana, but also cocaine and heroin, and argues that when these things are produced in a legal market, not in a black market, when it's produced in a legal market, then they're going to be, the drugs are going to be safer, right? It's going to be a produced in a market setting where consumers have an expectation of safety on the part of from the good that they consume. And so they'll have some recourse against the seller in a legal market. Where in a black market, where are you going if you get some bad weed? Who are you going to report and say, that you're not going to the Better Business Bureau and saying, hey, this weed had some other bad stuff in it, made me really sick, and I spent time in the hospital, almost died. You have no recourse like you would in a legal market. So what are conclusions we can draw from this then? First of all, Austrian welfare economics, we say our main conclusion is that voluntary transactions, the ones that are absent coercion, are at least ex ante mutually beneficial. People enter into exchanges because they expect to benefit. I'm giving up something I value less, and I'm getting back something I value more. If the legal framework considers transplantable organs as the doctor's private property, then we can analyze exchange of organs just like we could any other exchanges. And if some or even most market participants find the transaction is morally objectionable or repugnant, then the supply or the demand, or both supply and demand will be very thin. But so what? It's not a problem if there are a small number of buyers and sellers. We don't need some arbitrarily determined number of buyers, arbitrarily determined number of sellers. There are some interesting empirical features of the kidney market, like the idea that we think the supply is probably pretty elastic and pretty responsive to a change in price. But more generally, repugnance is just another form of subjective preference, right? We think this is great, this is beautiful, these things are gross and detestable, blah, right? That's just subjective preference, and repugnance is a part of it. That's all factored into the economic actors' subjective value scales, right? So this is not a form of market failure. Repugnance is not a market failure. And repugnance is not even an actionable externality, right? There are no property rights issues in externalities. So we don't need special complex market designs for these transactions. We can allow the beautiful, elegant workings of the price system to allocate these scarce resources, and we'll just allow it the chance. Okay, thank you.
Será que a gente começou a parar os cartões? Sim, sabe aquela cena? É muito boa essa cena. Onde, filho? Você mostrou a foto lá pro cara. Não, foi ela foi você da mão de gravata. Boa, João. Perdeu a aura, hein? Tem que dar uma farmadinha agora. Mano, na moral, sim, mas é uma cena no teatro. Os caras viram. Mano, então, você já viu o campeonato de Farma Aura lá que você daqui? Foi na desgraça de São Mateus. Regimado. São Mateus Farma Aura. Você viu isso aí? Esse campeonato de Farma Aura. Vamos participar.
Welcome, everybody, to the lecture on race and discrimination. My name is Dr. Njoya, and I'm the Walter E. Williams Research Fellow here at the Mises Institute. And I want to just draw your attention to some of the points that you've already heard about this week, about reason and logic, and how we think about the economy from the perspective of human reason and human action. And I want to apply that to understanding problems of race and discrimination. So I don't want you to think of this as a separate topic that's not connected to what you're learning this week, but rather to think about how you apply what you're learning this week to problems of race and discrimination. And so I particularly want to highlight some of the ways in which the debates go on amongst progressive economists. And so you can think about, I mean, I think you already know they're wrong, but you can think about specifically where they're going wrong when they talk about race and discrimination, because they purport to have evidence that discrimination causes economic inequality. That's really their main argument. They're saying the problem with discrimination is that it causes economic inequality, and we want to eradicate economic inequality, and so we have to worry about race and discrimination. That's their basic argument. And so you have to think about why they're wrong and why their purported concern with economic inequality is not causally connected to problems of race and discrimination. That's really the point that I want to make. So our starting point is the importance of reason and logic. And I want to encourage you to make that always your starting point. When somebody says we must always start by thinking about reason and logic, it's easy for you to think, well, that's obvious. Where else would you begin? But as soon as you launch into debates, reason and logic fly out the window. You actually have to make a conscious effort to ask a progressive who's trying to preach to you about some random thing. You have to make a conscious effort to put them to explain the reason and the logic of their position. So let's begin with the logical structure of reason. I think we've already heard that all human interrelations, and here I'm quoting from Ludwig von Mises, all human interrelations are based on this assumption of a uniform logical structure. We can speak to each other only because we can appeal to something common to all of us, namely the logical structure of reason. Most of my quotes today are from Mises's book, Omnipotent Government. But actually, the best place to go to understand his argument is human action. Because that has to be our starting point. We have to presume the humanity of the people that we are in debate with, because if we don't, we have no foundation to even be in a discussion with them. And the only thing you can do when you disagree with people is to fight. If you don't assume that the other person is also human and also able to reason according to the same logical structure, it's one to which we're all committed. It doesn't depend on where you're coming from, what's your economic background, whether you're an Austrian or you follow the Chicago School, or whether you're a sociologist, as they call themselves. It doesn't matter what your back. I hope there's not a sociologist here, get offended. It doesn't matter what your background is. We're all committed to the same uniform logical structure. Sometimes when I'm debating with people, often when you start a debate, you don't say, right, let's start with reason and logic. That's taken for granted that that's obviously going to be a starting point. If you start by asking somebody, do you hold to reason and logic? They'll say, of course I do. What are you asking? But if you just go through the debate and they start saying things that are irrational and unreasonable, and then you ask them if they hold to reason and logic, they start dissembling, because now they realize they're being completely irrational and they don't want to say, oh, no, I don't believe in reason and rationality. Nobody wants to admit that. And on this point about all human interactions being based on a uniform logical structure, sometimes I ask people, when they start saying, oh, but race discrimination is a huge problem and it affects Black people, they're so traumatized by their history of discrimination that you can't expect them to follow reason and logic. And sometimes when we're, deep into those debates, I might say to them, do you think that Black people are human? And then they don't want to answer. Would you believe it? Why don't they want to answer such an obvious question? Look, if you had asked them that at the very beginning, they would say, of course they are. What are you talking about? What do you take me for? But now they're in a bind because they've already rejected reason and logic. And if they admit that the people they're talking about are human, then they also have to admit that we have to assume a uniform logical structure. It's what allows us to speak to each other. So this is the importance of this point. And Mises highlights that reason is common to all human beings. It's not that some of us are reasonable because we are lucky, and other people who don't have our advantages are so unfortunate, so they have no awareness of reason. Reason is common to all human beings. So some people don't know that reason is common to all human beings because they commonly encounter unreasonable people. So they say, well, it can't be common to all human beings because look at these unreasonable people. Mises doesn't mean that everybody is equally reasonable or everybody is equally able to think logically. Not everybody is Aristotle. Okay, so there are obviously going to be differences. He says some men can think deeper and more refined thoughts than others. That's actually how we learn. We learn from people who've thought about something deeper than we have. So we're not just saying that because reason is common to all of us, that means all our thoughts are equal. With the way people say, my opinion is the same as your opinion. So, you may be a nuclear physicist, but I have opinions about how you should be running nuclear physics and that should be treated equally. That's not what we're saying here. We know that some men, unfortunately, cannot grasp a process of inference in long chains of deductive reasoning. So I think we heard from Dr. Gordon about deductive reasoning. And as it gets more and more complicated, sometimes you lose people along the way. And I think even many of us, if you're reading Human Action, you're reading Mises, many of us have to read it a few times and really think about it because it's complicated stuff. So we have to think about it and maybe talk to each other about it. And each time we read it, we understand it better. So we're not trying to say that because reason is common to everyone, it's equally easy for everyone. So the mere fact somebody doesn't understand a process of a chain of deductive reasoning doesn't mean that they're incapable of reason and logic, or that you should abandon reason and logic because some people aren't able to follow what's being said. You've seen this happening in the academy. This idea that everybody has to be able to follow the reasoning or the logic of the course. And so if chemistry is too difficult for some people to follow, we have to start teaching decolonized chemistry, I think they call it. That's going to be easy for everyone, you know, and we're always going to teach to the lowest common denominator so that everybody follows what we're saying. Mises rejects this completely. He says, as far as a man is able to think and to follow a process of discursive thought, he always clings to the same ultimate principles of reasoning that are applied by all other men. The fact that somebody is thinking illogically and unreasonably does not mean that they are not human in the sense that they too have goals that they want to pursue. It's just that the method they've chosen for pursuing their goals is not going to lead them and never leads them to the goal that they're trying to achieve. So what we would say about people like that is that they got it wrong. If that's the goal they want to achieve, they need a different method. And that's really the lesson, I think, of this lecture on race and discrimination. If you're saying our goal is to improve our economic conditions, then clinging to your explanations about discrimination are not going to get you to that goal. That's the very definition of being illogical and unreasonable. You should choose the method that is going to get you to your goal. Mises acknowledges that men are not always reasonable. So sometimes when you tell people about human action and reason and logic, they think that what you're trying to say is that man is always rational and is never irrational. People think that they can criticize the Austrian School by saying, oh, they're completely wrong, because in fact, people are not always rational. Sometimes we're emotional, sometimes we're unreasonable, we make mistakes because we're human and we're fallible. And people think that when you emphasize reason and rationality, that you're trying to pretend that you never make mistakes. That's not the case. Mises says daily, it is true, people violate logical principles in reasoning. We all do. We all make mistakes. The whole point of logical reasoning is that somebody can show us the flaw in our reasoning. And then we can say, that's where I went wrong in my reasoning. And we can correct ourselves. Mises says, whoever examines their inferences competently can uncover their errors. That's something that's fun for most people to do. You can say to your friend, here's my argument, here's my reasoning, tell me where I went wrong. And you can follow the deductive chain and you can see where it went wrong. And most of us like that because we feel enlightened, we feel corrected. Mises says, because everyone takes these facts to be unquestionable, men enter into discussions. Why else would you be in a discussion with people if you don't think they're logical and you don't think they can be corrected? They speak to each other. They write letters and books. That's why you tell people to read. That's why you give people reading recommendations. They try to prove or to disprove. Social and intellectual cooperation between men would be impossible if this were not also. We'd just be living in conditions where we join up with people we think are like us and just start fighting. We would not have a civilization. And Mises, when he talks about human action and reason and logic, he's saying this is the foundation of civilization. There are actually no other conditions on which men can live a civilized life. And sometimes when people, especially people progressives in the modern academy, when they say things like, well, reason and logic are optional, they say reason and logic are, whiteness, and other people who don't want to follow reason and logic should be left to follow, I don't know, their superstitions. What they're saying is they consider civilization to be optional. That's really what they're saying. And Mises rejects this. He says, in the course of the 19th century, this undeniable fact has been contested. You suddenly had, I would call them intellectuals, academics in particular, who started to reject reason and logic and to offer this as a plausible alternative. Marx and the Marxians, primarily, he says, foremost among them, the proletarian, so on behalf of the working class, philosopher Discrimination, taught that thought is determined by the thinker's class position. It's your class position that determines your thoughts. And so the working class has a way of thinking that follows a different logical structure to the aristocracy. That's what he was teaching. And now what they call race Marxism introduces race instead of class. So we're saying people have a logical structure of thinking that's determined by their race. So white people have a logical structure of thought. Black people have a different logical structure of thought. And if you want to know what somebody's logical structure of thought is, you have to know their identity. You have to know their race. You have to know their class. You have to know their sex. Otherwise, how will you know their logic? So that's what the Marxians are now teaching as the more enlightened way of understanding the world. And in Omnipotent Government, Mises also makes the points that the Nazis adopted exactly the same approach to thinking. It's the same polylogism where they say your thoughts are determined by your race, your logic is determined by your race. Really think about how poisonous this is. It means that when somebody of a different race is speaking, you can't tell them that's illogical, that's unreasonable, because they're following their logic, their reason. So you might say that's different from my reason because I'm a different race, but it's reasonable within their system of logic. That's what polylogism is. It's saying nobody can dictate principles of logic to anybody else. If you read a book about principles of logic that's written by a white man, you're supposed to say, oh, well, he's setting out the principles of logic that apply to white men. I have a different approach to logic where, A is not A. That's my logic, and you can't tell me I'm wrong because I'm not of the same identity as you. So they want to know everybody's identity because then they can determine. I think I've given this example before of a mathematician, Australian mathematician, very good mathematician as well, who says, well, I'm a white woman, so this is my mathematics, and I'm not going to impose my mathematics on other people who want to do mathematics based on smoke signals, because that's how they do mathematics, and I shouldn't make them do it my way. So this is the way that they think, and they have rules like, for example, when you write papers, they look at your bibliography or your footnotes, your citations. They call it citational diversity. They want to see the race of everybody in your bibliography. I don't even know how they would know everybody's race because you can't always tell by the name. But they want you to show that you've got diversity in your citations because otherwise you've only spoken about the logic that applies to your race. You've left out the logics of other people's races. There was a time some years ago, somebody reviewing Thomas Sowell's book didn't know that Thomas Sowell was Black because you can't tell from the name Thomas Sowell. So he criticized, he said, who's this white supremacist, Thomas Sowell, he talks like that because he's got white privilege. If he would only step into the shoes of a black person for one day, he'd realize that everything he's saying is wrong. And this was published by the London School of Economics, because none of them thought to Google him to see what race he is, which is what people actually do now in order to meet the goals of their citational diversity. And so Mises rejects this completely. He says polyllogism is the replacement of reasoning and science by superstitions. That's really all it is. It's superstitions. He says it's the characteristic mentality of an age of chaos. Look at some of the arguments that people raise today in all seriousness that are nothing but superstition. Take the example of people who want to destroy the historic war memorials of the South. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Their statues have been standing for over 100 years, and people say, we need to destroy those. And you ask them, why? What's your reason? Look at the types of things they say. Oh, I feel like he's watching me every time I walk past. I don't feel safe. It makes me feel traumatized. That is superstition. And you can prove that by showing that even when you get rid of all these statues, people don't feel better because their grievance wasn't reasonable in the first place. It was superstitious. There was somebody seen by a journalist standing at the spot where Robert E. Lee's statue used to stand in Charlottesville before they took it down. And he was standing there brooding and feeling really sad. And the journalist said, what's the matter? The statue is gone. He said, yeah, I can still feel it. I can still feel it here. We've replaced reasoning and science by superstitions. And this is the characteristic mentality of an age of chaos. What do we mean by chaos? We can't even reason in these conditions. The only way that man is in a position to act is because he has the ability to discover causal relations. When you talk about means and ends, you're assuming that you know what's going to cause you to achieve the ends that you're trying to achieve. And if you choose the wrong means and you don't achieve the end you were trying to get at, then you know that the means you chose were wrong. They didn't get you to the results you were trying to achieve. So this is something that we assume. It is only because we know that causality matters that we're able to act in the first place. In a world without causality and regularity of phenomena, there would be no field for human reasoning and human action. Such a world would be chaos. Everything would be random. And you can just imagine, it's almost dystopian to live in a world of such chaos where nothing causes anything else. And you don't know what will cause things to happen. And when things happen to you, you don't know why they've happened to you. You don't make any connections between how you're behaving and the results you're achieving. That's why you see people going completely crazy. And you think, why is this person so angry? And they're saying, oh, it's racist, it's racist. They don't have any conception of cause and effect. This is what Mises is describing as chaos. Such a world would be chaos in which man would be at a loss to find any orientation and guidance. You're just spinning in circles all the time because you don't know why anything is happening to you. Everything seems random. And then the progressives encourage this kind of chaos by telling people, yeah, there's no explanation for why that's happening other than the fact of discrimination. So take the example of people being arrested. You know, the police have stopped them on the highway and the police say, can I see your documents? And they say, why? And the police says, you were speeding. No, I wasn't. If you watch these videos of people being arrested, they always reject everything that the policeman says. Why do they do that? You may think it's obvious that that's why you were stopped, but it isn't obvious to them. They live in a world of chaos where nothing is connected to anything else. And so cause and effect is something, the idea that my speeding has caused the policeman to stop me is completely alien to them. And that's what Mises is saying here, lack of any orientation and guidance. History becomes similarly chaotic if you don't have some sense of the importance of causation. The data of history would be nothing but a clumsy accumulation of disconnected occurrences. All people can tell you is what has happened, but they can't tell you why, and they can't tell you what has caused anything else. It's a heap of confusion if they could not be clarified. And this confusion is actually painful to people. It's painful to people to live in such a sense of chaos and confusion where they can't explain anything. Sometimes, if you look at progressives who give advice to confused people, and they tell them things like, yes, you're right, everyone's being unfair to you and everyone's being discriminatory to you. I'll give an example that I've spoken about before. This is a situation that happened in the 1950s, somewhere in Georgia, in the deep South. A group of Black people in the bus drinking whiskey, loud, noisy, and chaotic. According to them, they were not drunk, okay? But according to the driver, they were. So there's a kind of difference of opinion there. So the driver is trying to talk to them and they won't follow the driver's instructions. So the driver called the police. And this was the 1950s. When the police showed up, they were not gentle, let's say, with these people. So it all ended up in violence, let's say. Because when the police said, get out, you're under arrest. No, I'm not. Started trying to fight with the police. I think one of them tried to seize the policeman's weapon off him. So this all didn't end well. Now you may think about this and think, well, the behavior had some role in causing the outcome. But this is not how this story is reported today by our progressive intellectuals. They say that this story shows how racist police are. That's what you're supposed to learn from that story. You're supposed to learn how racist police are and why they beat people up. That's the lesson they're taking. So then they start advising people. The police are so racist. If the police are racist to you, you should call the lawyer. You should call the civil rights people. Then they can fix your problem for you, because these police, they're out of control. They never, ever tell them to behave better on the bus. Why? Because they don't want to accept that there may be some causal connection between your behavior and the outcomes you're experiencing. And that's what I'm calling a heap of confusion. You can't clarify anything. You can't explain anything. You can't tell what's causing anything else. And this is what Mises says. You need systematic praxeological knowledge to be able to make sense of what you're seeing in the world. And this is the importance of causality. Correlations between the various pieces of historical data cannot establish causality. This is Frank Shostak in his article, which is on the Mises website, Does Correlation Mean Causation? He's talking about the money supply in this article. So people say, increasing the money supply causes economic growth. So if you want economic growth, you need to print more money. That's the causal relation they think they're seeing. But he says what they've done is to track correlations. They're saying, oh, look what happens when we print more money. The rate of growth of GDP is going up. This proves that we've got economic growth that was caused by increasing the money supply. He says correlations between various pieces of historical data cannot establish causality. Even if you show that you've done this a bunch of times and the GDP always went up, you haven't established causality. He says correlations can only describe, but not explain. He says causality can be ascertained by means of establishing the definition of the subject of investigation. So in his example, he's saying if you understand what money is, so you know that by printing paper with a dollar stamped on it, you aren't really doing anything. If you understand in the first place what money is, and if you understand in the second place what the economy is, and if you understand what economic growth is, you're going to avoid this error. The error, he says, is caused by not understanding what it is you're investigating in the first place. And I think this is really relevant to what we're discussing here with race and discrimination. To ascertain causes, you need a sound theory. This is what Shostak is saying, and I think he's absolutely correct. You need a sound theory or you can't make sense of what you're observing. So all these race and discrimination people, all they're telling you is what they've observed. I saw the police beating up a Black person, and this shows that high rates of criminality are caused by discrimination. So this is how they have no theory to explain what they're seeing. They assume that it's caused by discrimination. So let's take an example of the crime statistics. Apparently now, even citing crime statistics is discrimination. Why? Because the statistics themselves are discriminatory. Because you look at, let's say, Black people who are 13% of the population, and then you check the rates at which they're convicted of murder, and the rate is not 13%. In some contexts, it's as high as 80%, 87%. So you say, well, that must be because of discrimination. Whoever's collecting those statistics is discriminatory. And actually, if you check, the police are not allowed to show those types of statistics. They'll be told to go and fix it because that's discriminatory. So now they start logging Black criminals as white. They have to do that because otherwise the statistics are going to show discrimination. So you look at the mugshot and you can clearly see this is not a white person, but he has to be logged in as a white criminal so the statistics don't look like they're showing discrimination. So these are the types of things going on. There is no theory, there's only chaos. And Shostak says to ascertain causes, we need a sound theory. And so I want to emphasize the importance of causality. Only a man who sees the world in the light of causality is fitted to act. In this sense, we may say that causality is a category of action. The category means and ends, of which I think we all know, presupposes the category cause and effect. So you must always be asking about cause and effect. You must always be asking people what has caused that. It's not just about showing how much, unfairness they're seeing in the world. You must ask, what is the cause? That's the lesson from Mises. So now let's look at the cause. And let's ask, does discrimination cause economic inequality? Because that's the question that economists want to answer. It is a causal question. Because they're economists and not moralists, or so they're supposed to be. They're not supposed to be just saying it's wrong to discriminate, it's morally wrong to discriminate. As they're economists, they're supposed to be asking, does it cause the phenomenon with which we're concerned, which is economic inequality? So if you look at studies of economic inequality, they're measuring disparities or gaps in economic outcomes between different groups, men and women, Black and white, and they're saying we want to ascertain the causes of this gap. And the question here is whether discrimination is causing economic inequality. And the economist Walter E. Williams set out to answer this precise question. He asked how much can be blamed on discrimination. And his way of approaching this was to look at the problem empirically. So he was empirically testing cases of discrimination. So we know that this group has been discriminated against. Let's look at their economic outcomes. So he empirically studied all different groups in America. And as you know, there are many different races and nations and peoples in the United States. He studied all of them. In fact, he has a list. If you look at this book, it's a great book for those of you who are interested in empirical findings. He has a list of all the different groups that he studied. So he studied British Americans, Italian Americans, Swedish Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Norwegians, Mexicans, and African Americans. He studied, and also Africans in America, West Africans in America. So he studied all these different groups, and he found exactly what you'd expect him to find. That some of these are doing exceptionally economically well, and others are doing less economically well. They're all suffering from discrimination. So he talks about, for example, when the Japanese Americans were interned in camps during the war. That is the height of discrimination. You're being locked up just because you're of Japanese heritage. So let's look and see their economic outcomes. Are they all at the bottom of the economic ladder today? Reader, they are not. So he's saying, look, I haven't found this discrimination causes inequality that people are talking about. He shows that it's completely, the empirical evidence does not sustain this notion that discrimination causes economic inequality. So what are the progressives on about when they say we're studying discrimination because it causes economic inequality? Progressive economists are approaching this in what we might call phony causation, or what Robert Nozick has called normative causation. When they say we want to find the causes of economic inequality, they're not actually studying causation. They're just looking for correlations. They're saying, look at all the things that Black people suffer. That must be why they're economically disadvantaged. That is not causation. It's barely even correlation, because they're not interested, as Walter Williams has shown, in tracking other people who've suffered from discrimination. So this is normative causation, as Robert Nozick talks about in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. You start by asking yourself, what do I feel ought to be the cause? It's the study of what the causes of problems ought to be. You've already decided what you're looking for before you even start looking. If X is bad and Y, which is also bad, can be tied to X by a plausible story, you then conclude that X causes Y. We want one bad thing to be caused by another. Look, discrimination is bad and economic inequality is bad. Therefore, discrimination is causing economic inequality. We're assuming that these relations are causal when they're clearly not. That's what's going on here. What do we want to be the cause of African economies being so behind the rest of the world? Oh, that's going to be the fault of the Europeans who arrived in 1652. This is a great painting, and somebody made this great meme where they're asking, why are you so poor and primitive? And they're saying, it's going to be your fault. There's another great meme on the same painting that says, why are you so poor and primitive? And then the natives answer, apartheid, which came in 1948, so long after the Dutch arrived. But they're saying, well, what do we want to be the cause? The cause is anything you want to be the cause. That is not what causality means. And Walter Williams says, despite frequent assertions to the contrary, many of the seemingly intractable problems encountered by a significant number of Black Americans do not result from racial discrimination. That's what he's found from his empirical studies. This is not to say discrimination does not exist. nor is it to say discrimination has no adverse effects. However, the question is not whether it exists, but whether it's the cause of what we're seeing today, which it is not. So if inequality is not caused by discrimination, what causes it? We're left without an answer, right? We want to know what causes inequality. So if all those empirical studies were wrong, we need to go back and do more empirical studies to find out what causes inequality, right? Wrong. The question is the problem. When you ask what causes inequality, you're asking the wrong question. And that's what the economist Thomas Sowell has spent decades trying to explain to people. You're asking the wrong question, then going to try and find the cause of something that does not call for an explanation. Why? Because there's no reason to there's no reason to expect human beings to be equal. There's no reason to expect that when two people apply themselves to the same industry or enterprise, they are going to have equal outcomes. So when you say, what's causing these people to be unequal, the question is already wrong. If anything, you should be asking, what caused the winner to win in the game that he was playing? That would be the interesting question to ask. Was he faster? Was he more intelligent? Did he work harder? Did he start out with more capital? These are the interesting questions. So it's not the gap that we're trying to explain, it's the success that we're trying to explain. And Thomas Sowell says, neither logic nor empirical evidence provides a compelling reason for expecting either equal or random outcomes. So people expect either equal or random outcomes. So in the context of crime, people will say when crimes are committed, you'd expect it to be randomly any race that's committing these crimes. Why should it always be Black people, right? It should be anyone randomly. It should be Chinese Americans. It should be Japanese Americans. It should be anyone committing these crimes. And if you're just consistently showing up with Black Americans, that's showing that something is wrong. No, nothing is wrong. Those are the people committing the crimes. So you can ask, why is this person committing crime? But you can't say, I want to try and explain this inequality in my statistics. He says we have no reason to expect random outcomes among individuals, groups, institutions, or nations. So the premise is false that says we want to explain inequality. Thomas Sowell says, neither in nature nor among human beings are either equal or randomly distributed outcomes automatic. On the contrary, grossly unequal distributions are common, both in nature and among people, in circumstances where neither genes nor discrimination are involved. That's his book, Discrimination and Disparities. And again, if any of you is interested in looking at the empirical work that he did to show this, you can find it in his several books on this point. But I think that as good Austrians, you don't even need the empirical studies to tell you this, because you know that people are not equal. If somebody asked you, why is the tall, fast, strong runner winning the race before the weak, untrained couch potato? If they asked you why, you wouldn't think you need an explanation. As Shostak was saying, the explanation is in understanding the phenomenon. You understand it, and that's what tells you the causality of why you ended up with that outcome. Thomas Sowell says nobody is equal to anybody else when it comes to performance. Even the same man is not equal to himself on different days, let alone if you track his entire life. You're going to find unequal outcomes even for the same man. So you don't expect everybody in society to be producing equal outcomes. So your question, where you say we want to ask why they're unequal, is completely false. Now, of course, Thomas Sowell has been rejected by the civil rights activists. They say, no, only the government can end poverty. Look, they've abandoned their pretense at being interested in causality. They're just saying only the government can fix poverty. And I don't care what you say. If you were a decent person, you would let the government keep trying and trying and trying. And when they fail, they should try again, because that's what decent people do. What I want you to notice is that they've abandoned their fake interest in causality. They just want to keep intervening because they think it's the decent thing to do. What should they be doing instead? They should be focusing on productivity. This is Robert Lucas, who says, if you're genuinely interested in poverty alleviation, you should focus on productivity, not on distribution. I think we all know that. And Mises says, there are for man only two principles available for a mental grasp of reality: teleology and causality. Teleology is a variety of causal inquiry. You want to know why people are pursuing the goals they're pursuing. That's what you would do if you were genuinely interested in causality. Final causes, here he means final causes in the Aristotelian sense. Final causes are first of all causes. Unless you start from the Misesian starting point, you are not going to understand productivity, and you are not going to fix the poverty problems that presumably people want to fix. So I think that's the real message to give about discrimination and race. But just as a postscript, let me address the people who may be feeling a bit uncomfortable. They're saying, okay, you've convinced me about the whole causality thing. Let's forget that. But isn't racial discrimination in any case, forget the economics. Isn't it immoral and unethical? And shouldn't we worry about it for that reason? Even though we're economists, we're also human beings and we want to be nice people. So shouldn't that be the reason we should care? Walter E. Williams would answer this in the following way. Define what it is that you're saying you're morally concerned about. Define your terms. Because he says all selection necessarily and simultaneously requires non-selection. Choice requires discrimination. If you want choice and if you want free choice, you cannot at the same time say, I don't want people to be free to make choices. Because that's what you're really saying if you say, I'm not happy with discrimination. You're saying, I'm not happy with a world where people are free. I'm not happy in a world where people are able to choose. That's what you're saying. Actually, this is why Milton Friedman, the Chicago economist, titled his book, Free to Choose. If you're free to choose, you are going to end up with some choices that other people are making that are not the choices you would make. Murray Rothbard has some even more robust language than that. He says, no, listen, you can't ask the person who's not bothered about discrimination whether they're being immoral and unethical. In fact, the person who's being immoral and unethical are the progressives. He says anti-discrimination laws or edicts are evil because they run roughshod over the only fundamental natural right, the right of everyone over his own property. Every property owner should have the absolute right to sell, hire, or lease his money or other property to anyone whom he chooses. And this means he has the absolute right to discriminate. So the moral case is not against discrimination. Actually, it's the opposite. The moral case is in favor of private property, free will, and the freedom to choose. Thank you.